Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ivanka Vis. I'm Professor of Innovation at ESADE Business School, and I also lead our Department of Operations, Innovation, and Data Sciences. Today, I would like to share with you some of the key findings from the research that I've been conducting with my colleagues on the topic of incumbent strategies and innovation practices as they are shifting towards sustainability. But before I get to the incumbents, let me start with the story of an exciting new startup called RenewCell. RenewCell started in 2012 on the back of a surprise discovery by two professors from KTH University in Sweden. They were studying a way to create methanol-based fuel from cellulose, which is a naturally occurring material in plants. And on the back of that, they discovered how to break down cellulose and create new textile from the cellulose that was degraded from old textile. Fashion experts, when they found out about this discovery, became immediately excited because this meant that all this glut of fashion waste that we are creating year on year could be recycled and created and made into new materials. Now, once that discovery was announced, a group of investors started to support RenewCell. They formed an incorporated startup, and they started to market the product that became known as Circulose, as in circular cellulose. By 2014, first Circulose dress was born. And what ensued after that was really a skyrocketing stream of events that were getting Circulose and RenewCell up and coming. So for instance, in 2017, H&M provided CVC investment, they pledged their support, and they will eventually become one of their main shareholders. By 2019, first commercial sales of 22 tons of Circulose was made, marking the beginning of the creation of new collections for Levi's and H&M that were based on Circulose. So in 2020, those first one-off collections were starting to get marketed, and the end customers loved Circulose-based fashion products. This marked a very important moment for H&M, who then decided that they will pledge their support for RenewCell, and they committed that over the course of the next 5 years, they will put Circulose in all of their brands. On the back of that pledge, Asian fabrics manufacturers that supplied to H&M and other fashion brands decided that they will set agreements with RenewCell to produce 275,000 tons of Circulose over the next 5 years. This was an outstanding moment. It was also marked by several awards that Circulose and RenewCell won in Times, in Fast Company magazine, and elsewhere. New letters of intent from other fashion brands and manufacturers ensued. On the back of that, RenewCell started to create their industrial scale production facility. And in 2022, they were able already to produce 60,000 tons of Circulose per year. This meant that they had everything they needed to deliver on 275,000 tons that they promised. Moreover, they were planning to expand their capacity to 120,000 tons soon after. But then, nothing happened. The agreements that were signed with the Asian manufacturers were stalling. They were not getting turned into contracts. The manufacturers were pointing fingers at the fashion brands that seemed not to be ready to launch new collections that were based on Circulose. By October 2022, RenewCell, by then already a public company, announced that they are having troubles with their profits, issued a profit warning, which did result in some support by fashion brands. Zara committing 2,000 tons and H&M 18,000 over the next 3 years. However, this was about 50% what Renewcell needed in order to break even, and only a fraction of the 275,000 tons that were initially discussed. A bit over a year later, Renewcell filed for bankruptcy. Circulose was sold to the private equity that will continue to develop it and eventually manufacture it. A really sad ending to a highly promising startup. Now the question that I have for you is, what would you think brought Renewcell down? Any thoughts from the audience? What could have been the reason for such an abrupt change from one day to another?
The acceptance.
Acceptance by, you mean by end customers? Fortunately not. The end customers loved the first collections. They showed a lot of support for Circulose. So that wasn't it. I would agree with you, that was where my mind went, but no, that wasn't the reason why they went down. Yes, please, sir. Intent from the fashion manufacturers. That's where we are getting closer. Yes, Tatiana, please. Cost was a challenge, but it was workable. Compatibility with supply chains, that's where we are starting to get again closer according to the experts, yes? Excellent point. So quality was still in the scale-up phase, but it was getting to the point where it was high enough. The quality from the end customer's perspective was high enough, but the yield was still not where they wanted it to be, where it ramps up. Let's get the last one.
Strengthen the relationships with the existing suppliers.
Excellent point. So that's where I think we complete our list of challenges. But let me kind of put them in perspective. So on one side, I would put the startup challenges, right? So the cost levels, technology, quality of the product, and yield. According to the experts, surely Renewcell was not an incumbent in terms of their levels of production and quality, but they were successfully ramping up to reach that level very soon. So that was not the major challenge, an insurmountable obstacle. What turned out to be a bigger challenge was actually the complexities on the incumbent side. So the fashion brand's ability to actually, change their business lines, to market the product, to get in line their supply chain, to arrange the relationships, the corporate governance of it, and actually help Renewcell turn Circulose into scaled green growth success. This was really what brought them down, unfortunately. And this worries me because this is not the single example that I can think of companies and startups that start from highly promising collaborations where bright innovation managers in large incumbent companies bring the startup to the doors of the company, perform great POCs that are successful, only to see the doors get shut once they knock on the business lines doors, okay? When it comes to the green growth startups, this becomes even more challenging because green growth startups bring in new KPIs, right? So they have to add sustainability KPIs to the existing set of KPIs that relate to customer acceptance or the business value. And so there the bar becomes even higher to accomplish all of the above at the same time. Moreover, they usually need to gauge the entire value chain and not only work with the business lines of the incumbent, but also with suppliers, distributors, and a range of collaborators that need to be all lined up in order for this to be turned into a success. So this is basically what I see as a challenge. And this is where my research has been focused, to uncover what could be the ways that large companies can turn this situation around. Fortunately, I'm delighted to share with you that we have found many incumbents that are working very diligently to solve these organizational and strategic issues. And I would like to summarize the findings that we have identified in about 3 strategic traits that we see at incumbents that are able to successfully scale green growth and that distinguish them from those who cannot scale. The first trait has to do with strategy. What my colleagues and I who study these topics find is that those incumbents who see sustainability and innovation as fundamental part of their strategy, rather than just isolated corporate structures, are the ones that are starting to see these problems addressed. So I'll illustrate this with an example of Italian electrical utility Enel. Back in 2014, Enel was a very traditional utility that was creating electricity from thermal fossil fuels, basically. Now, at that point in time, a new CEO took over called Francesco Starace, and he pledged that he will create a new type of utility based on renewable sources. His mission was to create something that became known as open power for sustainable progress. They got inspired by sustainable development goals, such as SDG 7 for clean and affordable energy and SDG 11 for sustainable cities and communities. Up to this point, the story sounds familiar, right? Net zero goal, SDGs, most of companies have been doing that over the last decade or so. But here is where the story starts to differ. When it comes to Enel, they turn these aspirations into actions, and they have done 2 important strategic steps to do that. The first one is to say no. They said no to sales that came from fossil fuels, such as, for instance, thermal heating systems like boilers. They said no to lucrative deals in the countries that did not respect human rights, and they also excluded the suppliers who were unable to do so. But in order to say no to something that's generating revenues and creating financial performance, you have to find a way to say yes to something that is creating value from the financial perspective. And what Enel has figured out is how they can say yes to sustainability problems of their clients that can be turned into green growth. And that was what compensated for everything that they had to say no to. And this is where the innovation story starts. Because where others see problems, innovators see opportunities. And innovators at Enel were the ones who were figuring out how to turn those customer sustainability problems into solutions of green growth and green growth opportunities. So this meant that at companies like Enel, but also Schneider Electric or Holcim, 80% of the project's innovation portfolio would start to become committed to 2 particular objectives. One was to manage the tension between the financial performance and sustainability by tapping into new sources of green growth. So for instance, Enel has started to work with their customers, beer producers, to help them eliminate thermal sources of heating and replace them by electrified sources of heating in collaboration with the startup Magaldi. We have seen similar examples at other companies. For instance, Holcim has been working on low-carbon cement. Holcim is a cement manufacturer of Swiss origin. But they also worked with startups who were focused on the carbon capture, utilization, and storage to help them store new carbon in cement. So we're seeing, again, this diverse sources of new green growth that help to manage that tension between sustainability and finance. The second thing was that there's a lot of tension between different sustainability goals. For instance, if you're trying to accomplish CO2 emission reduction, windmills are fantastic, but then the windmills leave, after decommissioning, poles in land and represent biodiversity hazard. Now, how to solve that? Well, NL has worked with their innovation teams and innovation teams at their startup partners to identify second use opportunities for those poles for purposes of gravitational energy storage that their startup was focused on. So these are basically the ways that you can use innovation to address issues of sustainability and turn them into performance. And so basically sustainability becomes the North Star. And these two tensions are then used to amount to about 80% of the innovation portfolio of the companies that we've been looking at. Now, what I have also noticed as I've studied this area is that there has been a big evolution in terms of innovation tools to cater to these challenges of turning sustainable problems into growth opportunities. So this is not to say that design thinking, lean startup, and all the other great tools that we have developed are not useful. They remain part of the toolkit. However, they do not help in one particular area, and that is when you try to break down lofty 2050 goals into today's opportunities, right? So in order to do that, just looking at what the customer is doing is often not enough. What companies do in addition is to create new types of tools that help in this process. So NL has created disposable 10-year plans where basically the top team of innovators as well as strategists would come together and they would imagine what the next 10 years would look like. This plan was disposable because while they were creating it, they knew that the future will change and that this plan will become obsolete. However, the process of planning gave them good idea of where they can start from and what are the near-term opportunities that can lead them to a viable future. I also saw very interesting uses of science-based targets initiatives, certified roadmaps that help to break down 2030 goals, for instance, into tangible next year objectives. Wisdom of crowd forecasting and the other strategic foresight tools that we will learn about today are starting to gain traction as well in this area. And one of my favorite is what I've seen at Holcim referred to as iconic extreme. Basically a practice of accomplishing very, very aspirational result, like say 100% green cement or concrete. Or in the case of collaboration with Norman Foster Foundation, a shelter that is called Essential Home, where you can actually just roll it out, cover it, and by spraying water over it, create this malleable sheet into a hard cement-based structure. So examples like this are not immediately deployable on scale, but they inspire teams of engineers and innovators to work towards something that can be commercially viable even in a long and mid-term and eventually reach that goal over time. So this is basically what we refer to as innovability. Sustainability is the what and why, the goal, and innovation is the how we get there. Now, contrast that with a company where innovation and sustainability operate in isolation or support a strategy that is, say, incompatible with the sustainability goals. For instance, cost-based or volume-based strategies and business models tend to be really hard to accomplish while at the same time lifting sustainability goals. And that is why we need the top team, the CEO, the board on board if company needs to shift to sustainability and innovability. Which takes me to my second trait. Trait number 2. At companies that we studied, sustainability and innovation over time becomes everyone's business. The reason for this is that sustainability is a systemic challenge, and the unsustainable practices can be found anywhere in the organization, and so can innovations that actually help solve them. At Enel, after Francesco Starace, CEO, took over in 2014, one of his major allies was, of course, Chief Innovation Officer Ernesto Chora. But his second important ally was Chief Financial Officer, or CFO. Together, CIO and CFO worked on what became probably one of the key innovations that came out of Enel, and that is sustainability-oriented bond. Sustainability-oriented bond gives better financing conditions, lower interest rates for those who pledge that they will accomplish certain sustainability standards, like a reduction, for instance, of CO2 emissions. Now, once you get to that point that you have favorable financing conditions, all of a sudden, it's not just environmentalists in the organization that get excited, but you start to open up the conversation with guardians of shareholders' interests, like board members, for instance. Enel has raised about $26 billion using sustainability-oriented bonds. And my latest data suggests that at the moment, companies that range from Schneider Electric to Chanel have collectively raised $300 billion US dollars on sustainability-oriented bonds. That means that this is the amount of money that's tangibly committed to long-term sustainability goals, and we'll need to innovate to get there. So to sum up, this is the organizational, what I call organizational route A. And it's a route where you get the support on the C-level and then turn that into getting support on the board level as well, through examples such as sustainability-oriented bond. But I have seen also different other routes. So for instance, what I call organizational route B is when teams at the middle management level, usually innovation managers and young potentials in business line, find good examples of green growth opportunities, something that could represent, for instance, a low-hanging fruit. They pitch that to the top management team, and they start to get that support from the top. And then the story goes on to the board level. So this is basically what gets sustainability ball rolling. We have seen also importance of keeping the momentum going through new roles, like Chief Innovability Officer, for instance. It brings together innovation and sustainability that was adopted first at Enel, but then also at Holcim and at Brazilian pulp and paper manufacturer Suzano. And this is just in the last 2-3 years. Other companies are having different structures, but we are seeing two prevailing factors. One is that sustainability and innovation roles are getting more power in the organization. For instance, Ernesto Chora, Chief Innovability Officer at Enel, had the veto power of large investment projects. No matter how lucrative the deal was, if it wasn't performing according to sustainability standards, it was vetoed. So higher power for sustainability and innovation, but then also dispersion of power for innovation. Ernesto Chora consciously gave away part of his power as the Chief Innovation Officer, innovability in his case, by sharing it with business lines. So instead of deciding which innovation projects he's going to pursue on his own, he invited business lines heads to make that decision together with him. And that is how they were able to scale more projects, because the vested interest was created from the business line right from the inception of the innovation projects. And this is an excellent pillar, and with these two, you can create a lot of results. For instance, scope 1 or 2 emissions or anything that exists within the company can be achieved between strategy change and the reorganizing internally. But there is one element that unfortunately requires the third and most challenging pillar, and that is complex sustainability challenges that are spread out in the entire value chain. For those challenges like CO3 emissions that happen at the customers or at the supplier side, you need to mobilize the entire value chain. And that is where the pillar 3 and our last pillar comes in. So, business ecosystem becomes corporate social movement. So think about, for instance, buildings, right? The CO2 emissions in buildings come in the production through cement manufacturing, as well as other building materials, but also through its use, heating or cooling, for instance. Now, how do you solve this problem when there are hundreds of companies involved into, creating these emissions? What we have seen from our research is that companies that decide to tackle this challenge are starting to commit to new ecosystem patterns and practices that go beyond what we have seen in the digital innovation ecosystem. There are 3 important characteristics that we're seeing. First is there is the emergence of new and unconventional partners. For instance, Enel, in order to accomplish their goal of sustainable cities and communities, has partnered with BYD, largest creator of electric buses. And together they sold thousands of buses to cities like Santiago de Chile, Bogota, and then several European cities. Now, what that required was not just co-innovation, but they had to change entire business models. Cities were willing to adopt, but they were not looking to make upfront investments. So they created basically bus as a service. This was the first time that BYD did something similar. And that innovation was quite substantial in terms of its impact. Others were made too on the technology level, new microgrids to support the peak hours of the buses, for instance. The second that I have seen is the level of the strategic influence that the ecosystem orchestrator needs to exert over its suppliers and its partners. For instance, Enel and other electrical utilities struggle a lot with the CO2 emissions of the cable manufacturers for electrical grid distribution systems. And in order to resolve those, significant capacity investments need to be made on the cable manufacturer's side. So how do you actually exert such an influence on your supplier? In the case of Enel, they started by being their key customers and pledged that they will buy substantial amounts of new cables. But they did not stop there. They also started to offer them to look for startups that can help their suppliers in the process of decarbonization, so extending their startup ecosystem. Moreover, they opened up their expertise, their innovation facilities for testing, for experimentation. So they literally co-innovated with these suppliers on an unprecedented level. Finally, and this is where it gets, in my opinion, particularly interesting, is that in order to get the cable suppliers to have sufficient demand, they had to bring their competitors also as buyers of the new types of cables. And so they partnered up with Iberdrola, which, as many of you know, is the biggest competitor of Enel and their Endesa. They partnered with Adani in India, and together created sufficient economies of scale on the demand side for the cable manufacturers. So this is the level of the innovation that required also formal relationships and alliances with these competitors. So let me kind of sum up what became different in this ecosystem orchestration 2.0. The first one was the level of trust and coherence in terms of values that was required, right? You don't go through strategic changes like BYD or cable suppliers did just for any companies. They really had to trust Enel on this. The second one is seeking startup collaborators, not just for yourself, but for your entire value chain, and sharing expertise and innovation facilities. Finally, formalizing those industry alliances then bring also competitors. And that requires change in mindset. Thinking about your competitors as collaborators can only be possible if you have a joint competitor to begin with. And in the case of Enel and Iberdrola and others, this was climate change and fossil fuel energy producers. So with that, I'm concluding my third pillar. And to summarize, these are the three traits that we have noticed at the successful scalers of green growth. Sustainability and innovation are the backbone of the strategy rather than just corporate function. We see sustainability innovations becoming everyone's business in the organization, not just isolated in one function. And then business ecosystem is turning into corporate social movement. I hope these capabilities and traits of our pioneers of sustainable innovation inspire you. And I would like to leave one thing with you, and that is that notion of green growth pilots that can inspire leadership. So I hope that there are innovation managers who will find their business line counterparts and attempt to look for those opportunities to showcase what innovation can do. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, very inspiring. Took a lot of notes. I'm Alexander Daut from Merck in Germany. I have many questions. I'll limit it to one.
I'm on LinkedIn and I'm in the breaks.
Right,
so
very good.
I'm happy to answer all
I'll
of them.
certainly follow up. So maybe the one, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the two organizational routes that you sketched out, A and B, which would be essentially top-down, bottom-up. Do you have any insight there? Which of those traditionally is more successful? Because I feel that a lot of time the top-down route is very person-dependent. Yeah. You need someone at the top who has that mindset. And oftentimes route B is blocked. You have a lot of motivated grassroots initiatives and so on, but they just get stuck somewhere in between. So maybe you want to elaborate on this a little more.
Absolutely. So you're right. None of the two is panacea, and there are unfortunately companies where neither of the two will work out. But in sufficient number of companies, and moreover growing number of companies, we see that either of the two is starting to work. So the answer was already somewhat in your question, and I would agree with you. The pros of the top-down approach is that it's quicker. Right? If you have the CEO and top management team that are already inspired, then starting from that generates quicker results. If that is not the case, and we have seen this, for instance, in companies like a chemical manufacturer of Moroccan origin or a textile manufacturer, where there wasn't, a lack of interest, but there was lack of awareness at that point in time at the top. Then those examples of green growth potential successes at the level of the innovation managers and at the high potentials of business lines start to become more relevant. So I would say if you have the great top team, that's quicker. Otherwise, middle helps. But it's also not a either or. Both ends work actually even better. Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay, so actually the time is up. So
I'll answer those in
Yes.
the
Thank you
break.
very
Thank
much.
you very much. Thank you, Axel.
appreciate it.